Awesome. Great. Well, thanks, Kim, and thanks, everybody. I think we have a really interesting presentation for you today. I tried to uh, pick something that was a little bit fun, has some of the educational aspects to it as well, and maybe some entertaining pieces as well. So let's see. I don't quite see my power. Oh, there it is. Fantastic. So as Kim mentioned, it's the presentation is titled "Cybersecurity The Board: Choosing Success Over the Sarlacc Pit." So you can't just throw a title like that up and not give a little bit of background. So I have a podcast series, the Cybersecurity Effectiveness Podcast, little plug, found on Spotify and iTunes and your favorite podcatchers. But I interview a broad range of folks, red teamers, blue teamers, reverse engineers, CEOs, lawyers, folks from the public sector, private sector, you name it. And we've had over 100 different podcasts so far. But I did a mini series in there where I focused on board members. So board members for financial services companies and healthcare companies and tech and security and public and private and you name it. And this presentation is predicated on those interviews and sort of the feedback that I had received from real board members talking about real problems and their real perspectives instead of just cybersecurity folks always saying cybersecurity is a board issue. And, we've been talking about that for a while. I wanted to get the perspective sort of from the other side, the people that are actually on the board and what they think. And one of the board members I was speaking with said that a lot of times when CISOs and security executives are communicating with the board, because they often lack the perspective that the board members have, they're not speaking the same speak. It's very painful. And he said it's similar to falling into the Sarlacc Pit. So if anybody out there is a Star Wars fan, that's actually from Return of the Jedi. And Jabba the Hutt was talking about when you fall into the Sarlacc Pit, it's indescribable suffering as you're slowly digested over thousands and thousands of years, which just sounds absolutely horrible. But that's how he explained it. And he said, but it doesn't have to be that way. So hopefully we can share some fun insights on how to avoid that and what boards really care about. Kim already gave you a bit of my background, all that to say this. I've been doing this for a really long time in a lot of places for a lot of different companies. I've seen a lot of things done wrong and certainly have tried to learn from that over the years. And we'll try to inject some of that into today's presentation. Brief agenda here. As I said, I try to keep this a little bit fun. If I just throw up a whole bunch of quotes from board members, that would get pretty dry pretty quick. But I'm going to share some historical perspectives on kind of technology and threats, kind of a build up to this. And that's really all about creating perspective and sort of trying to understand what boards really care about. I'm going to share these conversations with the boards, these quotes. You'll see who these folks are, how they tie what we're doing in cyber to business relevance, some of the hot topics they're concerned about, and then really demonstrating operational competency, which comes up again and again as a trend in this area. To kick things off, this is a great mentor of mine, Art Coviello. Art was the former executive chairman of RSA. He sits on the board of a publicly traded financial services company and too many cybersecurity company and tech companies for me to possibly list. He's been very well plugged in for a very long time. And Art says here, and I'll just read these quotes so you folks don't have to read it out. But while all board members don't need to be cybersecurity experts, they do need to be able to interpret risk metrics regarding cybersecurity, just like they do when understanding sales, operations, and finance. Only when there is an understanding of risks can boards provide the most appropriate oversight and governance. And what I like about his quotes, and we've got a couple of them in here, it's so simple. Like, they don't need to be the experts. They don't have to have the DNA necessarily that a CISO or a cybersecurity leader has, but they need to be able to understand the metrics, because everything at this level is based on metrics. There's no room for guessing and assumptions. We have sales, operations, and finance here. If you went to your CFO and said how much money's in the bank, instead of just telling you we have $20 million, the response is, well, we did a PCI audit, we follow best practices, MITRE this and this, that. They're probably not going to be the CFO very long. Now, security, we've kind of gotten a pass for a while because it's been very difficult to really get those hardcore metrics of what's working, what's not. But the reality is we've been asking for a seat at the board for a long time. Well, now we have that seat. We've had it for a while, but more often than not, a security leader will get a chance to speak to the board They'll show up there, they'll present for an hour, they'll go way too deep in certain areas, and it won't be tied into what the board members are really concerned about. And then next time they get invited back to speak, it's not for an hour, maybe they get 15 minutes, just because the board's like, we just don't have time. We look at 1,000 different types of risk, of which only one of those is cyber. And one of the things that are also mentioned, I don't have this quoted, is you said the most powerful committee now on a publicly traded board is the audit committee. And as you know, boards are made up of all sorts of different committees, from committees that look at compensation, to mergers and acquisitions, to marketing, and there's just tons of boards. But the audit committee now has stopped asking cybersecurity executives, do you have security controls in place to mitigate risk? Because the answer is always, yes, we do, but we still need more money. Now the question is leaning towards, can you prove that the cybersecurity controls that you have in place are effective? So there's that effectiveness word. And can you prove that that extra budget that you're asking from the CEO or the CFO is actually really needed, and you can't get that out of what we've already invested in? So it's really coming down to evidence and proof of effectiveness, as opposed to assumptions and best practice statements, again, at this level. And that's the expectation from sales and operations and finance, and it's now the expectation from security. So a little bit of historical perspective on things. I always like to look at sort of how we've gotten to where we are when it comes to threats. And if we kind of go, back in time, and we see these things happening, like the invention of the alphabet, and movable type, and et cetera, et cetera. Generally speaking, when we have a major advancement, there's somebody that's trying to take advantage of that. Right. In 1804, Joseph Marie Jacquard invented a device called the automatic loom. And this automatic loom was the predecessor to the computer punch card and punch tape. As you can kind of see from this picture, it looks pretty similar. And it's arguably the world's first computer. It actually predates Babbage and Ada Lovelace and all that. And again, this is the early 1800s, around 1804. And when he invented this, all this does is it's got input, output, memory. So it's, by definition, it's a computer. The only difference is this computer it's not electronic, obviously, but it was used for making textiles, specifically blankets. And those dots on the punch cards were simply different patterns that could be put into the blankets. They were finding that just having one of these machines, they could move from making about a dozen blankets a day to hundreds of blankets a day. So this was an order of magnitude difference in how effective that the solution was. And you could have multiple machines. Well, the problem was the employees were like, oh my God, we're going to lose our jobs to this computer. They didn't call it a computer back then, but we're going to lose our jobs to this machine. So they broke in one night and they actually sabotaged it. They smashed it to bits. So I always found that it was quite ironic that the world's first computer actually suffered an insider threat. So as we keep on going through sort of the evolution of technology, we have things like telephone, radio, television, mobile phones, et cetera. And then 1969, we've got ARPANET, and that was kind of the seed that kicked off sort of what we see as the internet today, with TCP/IP and Ethernet and personal computers. And we see this evolution through Google and Wikipedia and Twitter and iPhones to photographing a black hole in 2019. So all these evolutionary steps. But what you find every time there's a good, there's a bad, there's a front, there's a back, there's a light, there's a dark. There seems to always be this dichotomy. And a great way to look at it is sort of the consumerization of different areas in history. So if we look at the consumerization of the sea, for example, the first recorded use of the sea for commerce was about 3000 BC, and that was in the Mediterranean Sea. Well, the first recorded pirates didn't happen until 1300 BC. So that's about a 1700-year threat window before somebody said, hey, that boat going from the mainland to this island, why don't we just rob it? So that's a pretty big threat window. We generally don't talk about things in our space in terms of 1700 years. So that was the consumerization of the sea. Let's look at air. 1859, John Wise tried to use a hot air balloon to deliver mail. It crashed and burned. It literally crashed and burned. It was an interesting idea, but it failed. But the first hijacking didn't happen until 1931. So not 1700 years, but still a pretty big threat window from our perspectives today. And then we have space. So in 1962, we had Telstar, which was a television satellite from AT&T. It was just a couple of years after Sputnik. Now, we haven't seen a lot of exploitation in space. Generally speaking, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. You have to attack a base station, and what's the upside of this? And maybe it's for nation states for satellite warfare, but there hasn't been too much. But there have been some isolated cases here and there. One of them was in 2015 with the Trula data theft gang, and that had some command and control bot capabilities that were being used through a satellite system. So kind of, if you had to find an example, I guess that's one example, but there hasn't been a lot in there. Most of that's because of barriers to entry. And then finally, 1988, we have the commercialization of the internet, right? And basically NSFNet had a bunch of people with email, and MCI had a bunch of people with email. And they said, hey, why don't we charge them? And they can go ahead and email each other. What a novel concept, right? We look at it today and duh. But pretty much that had a zero threat window, because right about 1988, we also had the Morris worm, and all sorts of badness started happening, and people were taking advantage of it and exploiting the internet. So as we see, definitely a shrinking threat window as we expand. And we're seeing, again, this comes back to perspective, and a lot of what these boards are talking about when CISOs are talking to them, it's really kind of getting that perspective of the board member and what they're looking at. Here we're seeing that basic technology can shift advantage greatly. So about 323 BC, the Greeks ran the ancient world, and they didn't have very advanced technology by today's standards. They had bronze, and they had iron, and they had these phalanx units. If you ever saw the movie 300, they could fight as one massive unit, just marching forward and stabbing people with the spears. And they were highly, highly effective. Again, they ran the ancient world. That was until the Romans came around with this new kind of metal called steel. And they had this device called the gladius sword, which was a design they actually took from Spain. And they said, well, boy, let's not fight the Greeks on a flat surface going in one direction. Let's flank them. Let's fight them in the woods. Let's fight them on the rocks and the hills, and use different tactics and change our processes. And just because they changed those processes, again, not advanced by today's perspectives, and they went from iron and bronze to steel, they were super effective, and they completely wiped out these armies. So again, basic technology can shift advantage tremendously, right? And we're also seeing that complexity is a great, great enemy. Now, a couple examples here is in the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire, so modern day Turkey, their military were called the Janissaries. And they did not invent gunpowder or the musket, and they weren't the first group to use muskets in the military, but they were the first one to embrace it in mass. And they said, look, it could take us 3-4 years to train somebody to be really effective with a longbow. But you can teach somebody to use a musket and be pretty effective. They're maybe not the best marksman, but pretty effective within a week or so. It's very easy to use, right? There's hardly any complexity. It's easy to train. And they're relatively speaking easy to make at the time, even in the 15th century. And they were highly effective because the people that they were fighting were charging at them in a straight line, waving flags, playing drums. They had leather armor, maybe, chainmail, maybe. Either way, it was ineffective against gunpowder. And they were highly, highly effective, again, because they reduced the complexity of having to teach somebody how to use a longbow with something simple and powerful like a musket. And then a little bit more of a modern example, we've got World War II Germany. And World War II, actually, let's step back to World War I just to frame this. In World War I, Germany had about 20 tanks. They didn't have a lot. The US, England, France, et cetera, had far, far more tanks. And they had embraced this idea of mobile armored warfare. And Germany saw what happened during World War I. So in World War I, they went from having 20 tanks to building over 160,000 tanks and other armored vehicles by World War II. So they said, this is going to change the game completely. And they actually did it in a very secretive way, which we don't have time to get into, but it's an interesting story if you want to research how they built it. They pretended they were building tractors. But anyhow, they invented these tanks, and they built these tanks. The Tiger and the Panther were probably two of the most famous. And these things were highly, highly advanced, especially compared to like the US M4 Sherman tanks. They were built like clocks. They were very finely tuned. They're extremely powerful. They were hyper connected in terms of communication channels and things like that. They were state of the art. The problem was it took a long time to train people to operate these. And even more of a problem was if something broke down in the field, like it does, you have to have a really successful supply chain to be able to support these tanks, repair them, supply the parts, et cetera, get them going. Where the US and Russia, essentially, if you could drive a car, you could drive a tank. And they were pumping these tanks out left and right. In fact, Russia was doing it so quickly that a lot of times the people building the tanks were driving the tanks. And because of that, the United States and our allies were far more successful in World War II when it came to mobile armored warfare, even though they had a far, far inferior on paper tank. So again, complexity turns out to be a great, great enemy. But as everybody here knows, cyber's become this massive equalizer. And I always like this quote by Samuel Colt: God made man, but Samuel Colt made them equal. And that's in reference to the Colt revolver. So a small person is in a fight with a very large person. If they have a Colt revolver, things are all evened out. Samuel Colt actually never said that. His PR agency did, but we'll go ahead and give him credit. But if you look at cyber, it's very cheap, much cheaper than building a submarine or a stealth bomber or ICBM. Low attribution. If somebody launches a missile, you can probably figure out pretty well where that came from. A cyber attack can be much more difficult. Again, it's easy, it's cheap. You don't have to be a nation state to launch a cyber attack. You can be a splinter cell. You could be a rogue unit. You could be a terrorist organization. You could be an organized crime group, and it compresses space and time. A bullet can only go so far, but a cyber attack really is pretty much limitless. And to compound that factor, a lot of these organizations that are cyber criminals by night are nation state actors by day. So they have the same infrastructure, the same tools, the same capability, and they're given safe harbor, which basically means as long as they don't hack within their own country, whatever country that might be, they're allowed to go ahead and do all their cyber crimes. And every once in a while, the government might call upon them to do some political hacking, go into something that's not going to make them money, but it's kind of tribute for being allowed to have safe harbor. And it's not that different than the Pirates of the Caribbean, not Johnny Depp, but the actual pirates in the Caribbean in the 16, 1700s. Basically, they were allowed to do their pirate stuff. They could live on the islands, let's say in the Bahamas, for example. They could bury their treasure and draw maps and train parrots or whatever pirates do. But more importantly, they could sell the stuff that they had stolen and make money. But they basically said, look, if you're going to live here on our islands and do all your pirate stuff, if the Spanish or the British do come by, it would be really great if you took your ships out there and blew them up. So that was that safe harbor, and that certainly falls over to today. So again, all that to say this, it's really just predicated on perspective and understanding that evolution. So here we have Art Coelho again. And Art says, all companies, big or small, public or private, must embrace cybersecurity as a key issue. With today's threat landscape, if you don't, you're not meeting your fiduciary responsibility. Again, the simplicity is the elegance of what Art says. He says, look, it doesn't matter what's happening. If you are not taking cybersecurity into consideration as a board member, regardless of your background and what your organization does, you're not hitting your fiduciary responsibility. And quite honestly, you should not be a board member anymore. And it's just a very tongue-in-cheek way of saying that. So what we're finding is it's not really about cyber risk at the board. They care about cyber, but only because of its impact on financial, brand, and operational risk. So it's not, they don't really need to get into the bits and bytes of ransomware and different types of attacks and botnets and data leakage and things like that. They want to know what the impact of that is going to be on finance, brand, and operations. Now, because of that, you're seeing a lot of CEOs and even board members actually in the news, even for power and energy companies. And I say even for power and energy companies because historically, power and energy companies haven't been the quickest to embrace cybersecurity. And now they're speaking about it publicly. And it's not because they went to bed one night and when they woke up, they go, God, we got to really, really focus on cybersecurity. This is the new. This is what we need to worry about. It's because they have to, because their stakeholders and their shareholders and their partners and even their employees are concerned about cyber. So it's something that needs to be discussed. It needs to be addressed. And they're talking about it on the news. There's tons of videos on this now. Further, you're finding cyber being mentioned in annual reports, corporate governance documents, committee charters, right up there with natural disaster issues, political distress, issues with unions, mergers and acquisitions, and all the other business relevant issues that organizations talk about. Cyber is there now. Now, they want cyber to be represented when they're talking about this, they need it to be with evidence measures like other strategic business units. Again, they don't want to be talking about this in terms of, hey, you know what, these are the things we're doing with patching and vulnerability scanning. And this is what, you know, how we're testing to MITRE ATT&CK. They want actual measures. This is how effective we were last quarter. This is how effective we were this quarter. These are the changes that we're implementing. And these are the changes that we want to implement by the end of the year. And this is how it will help impact finance, brand, and operations. Now, across the board, I heard all these different things that board members were concerned about in terms of just general security operations. And a lot of them kind of fell into this bucket of 6. And again, it's a different perspective. And a lot of times this is such an afterthought. It's such a gimme in terms of these 6 things that they really care about, that we can sometimes overlook them. But to them, this is the goal. This is what, as security professionals, we're here to protect. And again, very simple stuff. You're all familiar with this. So securing communication, things like email and chat, making sure it's safe, right? Protecting financial systems, customer data, intellectual property, okay? Protecting the sensitive data. Assuring availability of critical applications and the infrastructure that supports them, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. Safeguarding access, making sure that only the people that are supposed to have access, and then demonstrating compliance. And probably not just placating auditors with a little checkbox that says we did this scan or we did this assessment, but actually leveraging that as a lever to help guide investment into other areas as it comes to privacy and security and safety and things like that. So those are the big 6. And what you're not seeing there are the things that generally lead the conversation when talking to boards, which is about how much Bitcoin should we buy when we have to address ransomware, and what should we do if we have a data leakage attack. These are all important things, and they need to be covered and they need to be discussed. But again, at this level, with the attention span and the focus of the board when they're talking about cyber, these are the 6 things that generally bubbles up to. Here's Alexa King. She's an interesting board member because she's also a lawyer. So she comes at this from a bit of a different perspective. She says, if you provide boards with evidence-based data regarding your cybersecurity posture, trends, threat intelligence, effectiveness, et cetera, they should be able to provide you with valuable input based on their broader perspectives. I love this quote, and I included it to show that it should be bidirectional. Right? It's not just security executives presenting to the board. As security executives, we should be getting information back from the board because they have this broader perspective about what the business is doing. And they should say, hey, you know what? Have you considered this? Or we're partnering with this organization that's done this and this. You might not be aware of it. You could follow up on this. All this to say that you should be getting something too. So it shouldn't be one way. It should be a two-way street. And she really made that clear. And she says being a lawyer gives her a little bit of a different perspective when she's in these meetings, because sometimes she's put on different committees that have a need for somebody with a legal background. And she says this definitely has to be a bidirectional communication path. And that's one of the interviews that if you want to check out, it's really interesting because she's the only one that I interviewed that's a lawyer and a board member. Another thing that it comes down to is business relevance. And I keep on hearing about business relevance. So it doesn't matter. Across all industries, we rely on critical assets. And this is to generate revenue, deliver services, be competitive, et cetera. So critical assets obviously are the key to the business. So they want to make sure that those are being protected. Also business continuity. They want to make sure in the face of an issue, if data is stolen, if a system goes down, that the business can still operate. That's not always just a cyber issue that could possibly cause that. There's other problems like earthquakes and things like that, but wanting to know that. And again, they want conversations tied to these business relevant points. Regulatory compliance. Most people don't like it. We can't get away from it. But if you have to do it, again, instead of just placating auditors, being able to talk about privacy, safety, security issues from a regulatory mandate to ensure that you're doing what your peers are doing at a minimum, if not more. Critical asset protection as well, just not the critical assets in terms of the intellectual property, but the infrastructure it runs atop. And then this is the big one, rationalization and optimization. Now, a few years ago, I never heard somebody have a title, Vice President of Security Rationalization, and I never saw a security rationalization team. Fundamentally, all these groups do is ensure that the money that you're spending on security is actually delivering what it's supposed to deliver. And it's something that you bought 4 or 5 years ago and everyone's moved on to the next shiny thing. Are we still continuing to get value, Or do we just have this in a default configuration and it's not up to date, and it's not even providing value? Or worse, we've invested in 3 other tools and it makes that obsolete, but we're still paying maintenance on this solution, and we're not actually getting value, where we could go ahead and get rid of that product, retire it safely, which CISOs never like to do. They never like to retire a product because it might actually be adding some value that they're not aware of, but actually get rid of this. And then we can reinvest that money in products we need, more people, more training, on and on. And then not just rationalizing the investments and knowing how to prioritize your investments, and what to retire, but actually optimization. So if I spent $1 million on this firewall, am I getting somewhere close to $1 million of value? Honestly, we find most organizations are probably getting about 20 to 40%, if they're lucky, value, which is a horrible investment. I worked for ArcSight for 7 years on the SIM side, and SIM is a very expensive investment. And it was very unusual to find somebody that had fully optimized SIM, not because you had bad people or a bad product, just because it took a lot of time and care and feed and caring to make sure that you're actually getting that value. And also, SIMs are so dependent on everything within the infrastructure to be working properly as well. So garbage in, garbage out type situation. So again, keeping the conversations business relevant, and remember, rationalization, optimization, that's being hit on again and again. This is Matt Biggie. He's a former Army Ranger and sits on a ton of boards. Again, a really, really smart guy. Matt says, when I see boards, executives, auditors, and security teams successfully achieving good governance hygiene, part of that success is usually a result of cybersecurity leaders being educated in the fundamentals of business risk management. They understand the types of data, evidence, reports, et cetera, that the business needs. Again, I love the simplicity of this. They're like, look, most CISOs and security executives, I won't say most, a lot came up from a technical background. They might have been programmers or network engineers or pen testers or blue teamers or SOC managers or something like that, and they kind of climb the ladder. Not that many of them have that business background. They've kind of learned it over time, but they might not have been formally trained in business risk management. And because of that, when they're reporting and showing data and evidence and reports, it might not be the evidence and reports that boards are used to seeing, because they look at everything from a business lens. So sometimes it's education on our side to be able to understand how they want to digest the data. And one of the things a lot of security products are horrible at is reporting. It's usually an afterthought. It's usually like a version 3 or version 4 of a product before they get really strong reporting. But that reporting has to be something, whether it's through a product or you're pulling the data out and putting it into your own reporting system, that is emblematic of what they're getting from other business leaders. And I've heard from some CISOs that they actually talk to CFOs and they talk to, sales leaders and other people and look at what kind of reports are they presenting? How are they formatting it? What's the progression? What are the types of things that the boards want to see? So they're more in tune with those asks. One of the biggest things we're seeing is that the security formula is broken. This whole notion that if I put more money into something and I throw a lot of people and a lot of time into it, my security controls are going to be effective. Fundamentally, that's not working. All those companies I mentioned that I worked for at the beginning, ArcSight, Imperva, Solera, Cylance, Jask, Veridan, McAfee, whatever, I think we all had great products. I think we all had industry-leading products. I think a lot of the organizations we worked with were very strong and they had smart people doing good things. But fundamentally, some of these organizations have so many security products on site. As you see here in this one stat, it's not uncommon to see a company with over 70 different security vendors. I was working with a financial services company in England that had over 200 different cybersecurity vendors. And a lot of that came through the fact they were acquiring different banks that already had technology, et cetera. But could you imagine? We were talking about rationalization before and optimization. Hard enough to keep a dozen things working properly, let alone 200 or even 70, right? And a lot of times you're seeing huge overlap. You've got 5 different things where 2 would work. And because of that, you have a lot of misconfiguration or underconfiguration. Systems that should be adding value and could be adding value, but because you're using a default config, for example, you aren't actually getting the value that you should be from these particular devices. I mentioned before, SIM's a great example because it's a superset. I can't tell you how many hours I spent back in my ArcSight days helping to do correlation rules and temporal and volumetric analysis, and anomaly detection and pattern discovery and all these things, and writing these very advanced rules, for example. Well, for all that to work, you got to make sure your NTP, your time is right, all the parsing's correct. IT didn't throw up a proxy server that's now blocking all the syslog messages from your Oracle servers. Somebody didn't change a tap to unidirectional instead of bidirectional. So now your IPS isn't correlating anything and actually reporting anything up. There's about a gazillion issues that can happen before the events even get to the SIM. And now they get to the SIM and you're writing all these rules and doing all this cool stuff, but then you're crossing your fingers and closing your eyes and saying, I hope when something bad happens that everything reporting to the SIM is accurate and all that stuff I wrote is actually working properly. But historically, there hasn't really been a good way to test that. There hasn't been a way to validate that your security controls are actually effective. And again, that's a big reason why that security formula is broken and why SIM and IPS and endpoint security controls and cloud security controls often aren't providing you the value that you want to get. You're usually getting 20 to 40% value, which is a horrible rate of return. If you start looking at this like finance and sales and operations, the way that boards look at these things. Here's Jay Leak. Jay is very, very well known in the industry. Jay was the former CISO for Blackstone, so a very, very large publicly traded real estate / financial services company and a whole bunch of other things. And now he's a partner and co-founder with Clear Sky Security, which is a venture capital fund. But Jay said boards and business executives can generally quantify risks brought on by economic downturns, political changes, and natural disasters. But understanding preparedness and impact analysis for cyber is often based on assumptions because of a lack of evidence-based measures representing the effectiveness of security countermeasures. So here's that awful A word, assumptions. Assumption-based security has for the longest time been how we measure our effectiveness. Well, we think this is going to work because we've got a patch management program, or we've done a vulnerability scan, or we've done a red team assessment, or this or that. But we don't have any empirical evidence that will tell us if I get hit with attack ABC, how will my devices respond across endpoint, email, network, and cloud? Will they prevent it? Will they detect it? Will they alert on it within my SIM? How can I test? And now not just ABC, but 1,000 different other attacks and the thousands of new TTPs and IOCs that I'm receiving from my threat intelligence feeds every day. And now you see, wow, I really need some automation. I need some capabilities. If I'm going to be able to start talking about security from an evidence-based perspective regarding effectiveness, juxtaposed to an assumptions-based model, which is what we've been doing historically. Some of the common security findings that are reducing value that people have pointed out were causing issues are these weak out-of-the-box configurations. When people buy a product, they usually buy it for two reasons. One, how much do I like the SE? And two, when I do the product, I want to make sure it's not too noisy and it's not too quiet. If it's too noisy, you're going to make my job too hard. And I don't need my job to be harder. If it's not a little bit noisy, then I don't think I'm getting any value out of it. So for POCs, bake-offs, whatever, you kind of shoot for the middle. And that's probably the right place for a POC. But it's definitely not the right place for production. So you see a lot of these default out-of-the-box configurations, misconfigurations or under configurations. There's this term called environmental drift, where as soon as you get something installed, the network changes, people are hired and fired, technology is updated by vendors, parsing is changed, infrastructure moves from the cloud then back onto prem, then some kind of hybrid. There's always a constant set of change, which can have a negative impact on your security controls. We talked about the SIM issues before. I mean, there's tons of those. There's segmentation flaws. I work a lot with critical infrastructure, so SCADA, and generally you have your IT network, your SCADA network, then your industrial control system network. And A can talk to B and B can talk to C, but C should never be able to talk directly to A. And then all of a sudden we find these segmentation flaws where C can talk to A. And devices can be connected to and changes can be made and scary stuff can happen. Again, not because people are dumb, not because technology is bad, just because there's no way to effectively measure, at least there hasn't been historically, whether your security controls are doing what in fact they're supposed to be doing. So if you don't know that, then you don't really have anything to communicate to the board to effectively. Here's another Matt Biggie one. Again, he's the Army Ranger gentleman. But he said audit committees evaluate a wide range of risks, from standardized accounting practices to compensation of the board, the composition of the board. In cybersecurity, historically, the audit committees have lacked controls effectiveness evidence. So is my stuff preventing, detecting, and responding? Validation measures against threat intel. Is my stuff preventing, detecting, and responding against all that latest threat intel? Threat intel, by the way, is one of the hot topics for these boards. And optimization networks for incident analysis and response capabilities. Lacking these key data points results in audit committees being less effective at measuring and managing risk. Again, we talked about being able to educate the board. We talked about the board being able to educate you as well. But now we're also talking about enabling these different committees and groups and individuals on these boards to be effective at their jobs when it comes to managing overall risks. And one of the things that keeps on popping in is threat intel. And not just threat intel as a passive indicator of compromise that you use for forensic analysis, but threat intel as a tip of the spear, using it proactively to test and validate and measure the effectiveness of your tools, or even your people and your processes. That has come up as a big trend. Threat intel has been around for a while, but now people are wanting to see it personalized and operationalized and weaponized, if you will, to help test and validate your environments. And you're looking at security, we've been talking about effectiveness and rationalization, all these things. There's a few different tools out there that can help you with this, things like breach and attack simulation. There's security validation solutions. There's services that can provide part of this, at least a snapshot, as opposed to the automated mechanisms from BAS or security validation. But there's ways to approaching that. They're not just better. It's not just a firewall that goes a little faster, IPS that has a few more signatures or anomaly detection. It's a different way of looking at security. And it's a way of looking at it to say, I want to measure the effectiveness of my security controls to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to do. So BAS, validation, red teaming assessments, these are ways to assess those tools so you can actually give those measures to your board. And it kind of falls into a couple different pillars. Tell me where the gaps are. Where am I not blocking against what types of attacks? Maybe I'm blocking everything except data exfil over ICMP, or maybe I'm detecting everything except beaconing, right? So identify those gaps. Then prescriptively tell me how to tune it. Tell me how to fix it. So once I fix it, let me run a whole bunch of attacks safely with my production environment, real attacks, to tell me, are my controls working as I thought? So I found the hole by running a bunch of attacks safely. I was told how to fix that hole. And now once it's fixed, I'm going to have some assurances by rerunning those tests to see if my firewall did block, my IPS did detect, my SIM did generate an alert. I can tell you anyone that spent more than a day working with SIM could tell you this is a life changer, because now all those rules and all that work you put into SIM, you're actually validating that it's working. And then to mitigate environmental drift, you want to put that on auto test or autopilot, whatever the products offer or the services are doing, to say, I want you to run these 1,000 tests or these 2,000 tests or 10,000 tests every single day. And if something that was blocking or was detecting or was alerting has stopped, let me know so I can be managing by exception. Now I can rationalize. Now I can determine, where can I invest? How do I prioritize? What can I retire? I can map these things to MITRE and NIST and OWASP and all my other controls, which helps me with regulatory mandates as well. I've got reports now that show me how I can communicate with the board with the information they care about that shows, yeah, we're trending up now. We're able to actually stop data exfiltration, which ties to all that critical asset protection that you guys are really keen about. Also, we're protecting our communication paths, which means all that email and things like that you're concerned about. Now that's safer than it was last quarter or last year. Here's a gap. This is where we need to make an investment. So that $1 million I asked for the CFO, it would be great if you could give me your support with that as well, so we can go ahead and get those funds. So it all ties back to those key business relevant issues that they're talking about. Now, this is Julie Cullivan. She's really great. She sits on the board of some healthcare companies, some tech and cybersecurity companies. She says most would argue that automated, proactive, intelligence-led approaches, there's a lot there. We talked about automation and proactively testing your controls before the real attack happens, but also this whole notion of intelligence-led, using intelligence as the tip of the spear, the IOCs and the TCPs, coming in here to actually test and say to have these approaches to cybersecurity is where we need to move as an industry. So nobody would argue that. However, most organizations don't have the resources to maximize that value. This is another case where leveraging a third party can utilize their platforms and experts to help provide a service. This is important, again, because we're saying we want you to test all these systems. We want you to do it in an automated way, whether you're a big company or mid-sized company. Well, that can be a big ask, especially when you start getting into mid-sized companies where everyone's wearing a dozen different hats. But she brings up a great point. this might not be something that you do completely on your own. You might want to have some type of managed security services or retained consultancy group that can come in and do these things. If you can't do it in an automated way, 24/7, where you just kind of hit the go button and tell me when something's broken, sometimes it's nice to have MSSP or similar service that can go ahead and run these things for you as well. They're taking all the greatest threat intel that's relevant for you. They're testing all of your security controls, and they're giving you the reports and the data that you need to make investments and changes and report to your board. So that can be a really valuable thing, because I firmly believe that security validation and this type of testing, regardless of customer size, is something that has to be done in an automated or near automated 24/7 process, because things change that quickly. And the minute something that was blocking has stopped blocking, you really want to know. So again, you can manage by exception there. But you might not have those resources. That's a perfect world. So by having a third party that you can help leverage, that's a big deal. And that can really help a lot. And you're starting to see a lot more. MSSPs and services have been around since the beginning of cybersecurity. And they were kind of big at one point, like 20 years ago, and they still stayed relevant, but products kind of took front stage. I think we're starting to see a little bit of I'll say a maturation in this space now, where people are looking at a software platform enabled by SaaS, so security with a service, right? As opposed to just a service or just a platform. So that's something that's evolving pretty quickly. We talked about intelligence. I'll just spend a small amount of time on this, but there's a lot of flavors of threat intel out there. There's public sources and private sources. There's paid sources. There's ISACs. There's free databases like malware traffic analysis. There's aggregation sites that you can pay for. And they're filled with TTPs and IOCs, and some have more detailed reports on the latest APTs and issues out there. But I would say this, when you're looking at threat intelligence and how you're sourcing it as a tool that you can use for security validation or BAS to measure the effectiveness of your tools, keep your eyes open for a couple different sources. You should definitely consider free sources. You should definitely consider maybe a couple different paid sources if you think that's what's right for you. So I would tell people to look around, but I would say keep these things in mind. You want to make sure that the volume is at a point where you think these people have a big enough reach where it actually is important enough for you to pay attention to what they're saying, that their analysts and their people are trained appropriately. A lot of times you have IT security people, which are great, but might not have been trained in intelligence or schoolhouse trained with the government. So maybe they have a different perspective on things. How many sensors do they have out there? How much malware are they detonating? Look into these types of details when you're evaluating your sources. I'm a big fan of freemium. I'm not going to sales pitch anything, but Mandiant, we have a freemium offering. So you can sign up for that through Mandiant Advantage and check it out, kick the tires. If you want more, you can invest in more. And the security validation capability should be able to pull in threat intel from multiple sources. So you definitely want to think about that as you're talking about making threat intel your tip of the spear, if you will. And speaking of intel, here's Bill Kroll. He's the former deputy director of the NSA, is with the NSA for about 35 years. I've known Bill forever. We actually wrote a book together. So Bill, I thought, was a great person to talk about intel, having been with the NSA forever. So he says, having an intelligence-led approach to cybersecurity doesn't just make the security team more effective, it provides the evidence leadership needs to ensure that your goals, objectives, and priorities are aligned with their business requirements. So that kind of puts everything we've been talking about together here. This whole notion of I need threat intelligence to be the tip of the spear so I can validate my controls. And one of the reasons I need to do that is so I can show my board and other executives really that what we're doing in security is aligned with the business requirements of what we're trying to accomplish. So again, it makes security more strategic when you have this sort of intelligence-led approach, or having threat intelligence as the tip of the spear. Because now you're saying that the threats that I'm validating against my network, if I'm a financial services company, I'm using threats or APTs, and I'm looking at IOCs and things that are more specific to the financial services space, as well as some of the other general attacks. But how relevant is it? Is it personalized now? Can I take all that great intelligence, instead of just looking at after the fact, we can actually start personalizing it. I can test my threat intel against that firewall that I just bought. Or maybe I'm doing a POC against 3 different IPSs. And I want to go ahead and execute a bunch of attacks within that test network to validate how do those IPSs respond to this threat intel. Because maybe this IPS is great for you, but maybe for me and my environment with my architecture and my people, this other one's better. So being able to really personalize it and understand how safe is our network in the face of these IOCs and TTPs. If we're compromised, are we going to be beaking out to all these nefarious sites and leaking customer data? And then I have some outcome awareness. I know, and I can talk to my board or my other, the other executives and say, look, if this bad thing happens, this is what's going to occur. I don't have a way to block it. I don't have a way to detect it. Nothing's going to alert on it. If we want to block it or detect it or alert on it, I need some budget so I can invest so we can get the right tools in place or hire more people or whatever we have to do. So now you're basing budgetary asks on actual evidence, which is a godsend. All the reporting we talked about, the security we talked about, and the fact that you can automate these tests as you're adding new threat intelligence daily or sometimes hourly. So you're actually testing in perpetuity, either yourself or through another service. And there's a lot of great places, again, where you can get this threat intel. There's people like Anomaly, Mandiant, we have services. There's things that you can get from your ISACs as well. And there's just a lot of different players out there. But I would say, kick the tires on them. Good threat intelligence services should have a freemium offering because it might be great threat intel, but it might not plug into your infrastructure that well. So it might not be great for you. Another one from Jay Leak. I won't read this whole quote. It's a bit of a big one, but he says, boards and the C-suite are recognizing that software with a service, we mentioned that a little bit earlier. So it's not just a platform, not just an MSSP, but basically a platform with people behind it, is the future of cybersecurity. Technology-led platforms augmented by security and operations experts are delivering value via productized services. So this is fantastic. This is exactly where I think we need to move as an industry because we can't hire enough or train enough or retain enough to operate at the speeds we need. We absolutely need good cybersecurity teams, but they need to be augmented with experts that are very laser focused on these specific issues, whether it's threat intel or validation, to help augment these teams and improve them. Same reason why, a company, a bank, I live in Silicon Valley, isn't going to go to a VC and say, our business model is to be the most secure bank in the world. They're not going to get a lot of funding for that. That's not the business model. They need to show how they're going to make money for their investors and help customers, et cetera. Security should be an enabler to do that. And security itself needs an enabler to be more successful. And I think software with a service is a term that you're going to hear more and more about as people want to leverage these platforms, but at the same time as leveraging these platforms, they need some expertise behind it to help support that. And then finally, it's demonstrating operational competency. So, do I have evidence-based communication, not this assumption-based communication? So I can actually say what tools are working, what tools are not, how effective are we against this threat? When the boss calls and says, hey, I heard about this new, green cup attack. Okay, there's this green cup attack. Where do we stand as it relates to this attack? Well, let's go ahead and test our controls. Let's find out, do we block it? Do we detect it? Do we alert on it? Are our systems ready? And if they're not, do we have any kind of compensating controls in place to help address that? Demonstrate trending analysis. Can I look at things over time and how they're actually working and how they're able to function? Risk to partnerships and supply chains. This is a big one. More and more, I've been seeing this at least, is that the board level conversations are tied into these broader partner ecosystems and supply chain. Supply chain dependencies can have a huge negative impact. And of course, at this particular point in history, if anybody just turns on the news, we see some of the issues with our supply chains in this country and others, right? So that's a huge risk. So being able to measure those levels of security effectiveness, total cost of ownership metrics, and effectiveness of team and processes. Again, it's not just about your security controls, but it's about the people and the processes that are actually operating those. And then also relevance for the C-suite and the board, being able to ensure that, hey, what I'm doing is actually valuable. It's actually something that the board cares about. Because if they don't care about it, why are they giving me my 15 minutes in front of them to discuss these topics? So again, demonstrating operational competency is a huge, 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 huge issue. This is Kara Nortman. Kara works with a lot of cloud companies. She's with Upfront Ventures, a board member with several tech cybersecurity companies, but certainly a lot on the cloud side. She said companies are embracing cybersecurity services at an increasing rate. So we've kind of hit that one quite a bit. right? This trend will continue to intensify. Augmenting your cybersecurity controls, your teams, and your SaaS solutions with specialized expertise means greater security ROI and reduced risk. I love the simplicity of that. Specialized expertise means greater security ROI. So if I'm spending $1 million, hopefully I'm getting close to $1 million or maybe even more, and I'm reducing my risk, right? And I'm a firm believer of this. It's great to have a third party come in. It's the whole idea behind a consultant. They're not bogged down in the politics and whatever else might be happening in an organization. They should have a fresh perspective that's purely based on the issue at hand. That's the idea anyways. So if you have security specialized services, software with a service that can augment that, you get more value out of your investment. You can reduce risk. So again, that's another thing that can be looked at as well. And so my final thoughts here. Security is strategic to the business. I think everyone knows that. We've been talking about that forever. Certainly how long I've been in security, which is way too long, but it's strategic. But now that we have that strategy hat on and we've got that seat in the boardroom and we're having discussions at this level, man, we got to back that up with evidence-based metrics. We can't go in there with, well, this is my idea. This is a thought. This might be good. I don't know. This is my assumption. There's zero tolerance for that at the board. They want to hear the good. They want to hear the bad. They want to hear the ugly. And then they want to move on to the next item because they don't have time for that. So if you're going to talk at a strategic level, you have to have evidence-based measures. And one of the ways to get those is breach and attack simulation, security validation, leveraging threat intelligence, et cetera. The C-suite and boards are demanding more. And the reason they're asking so much of cybersecurity is they're being asked to talk about it. They need to go on TV and talk about it. They need to talk about it to their stakeholders and shareholders. They need to write about it in their corporate governance documents, in their committee charters, and their annual reports. So if you're not supplying them with the facts, they're either lying or they're not telling the whole story. Either way, that's not a good position for an executive to be in, right? Assumption-based security is dead. I think we kind of got away with it for a while because there weren't alternatives. There weren't really ways to measure effectiveness, but now it's all about evidence-based measures and security. And it's not just about the tools. People have been talking people, process, and technology when it comes to cyber forever. There's always been a little bit of a wink and a nod from vendors. And, I'm guilty of this too. I've had the Scarlet V on my chest for a long time. It's really more about product, 90% of it usually. But I would argue that especially today, you need to measure your security controls across endpoint, email, network, and cloud for sure. We've talked about that. Can I prevent, detect, or respond? But also, how effective are my people? Can I use this to help train them? When I run these tests, can I find out, oh, this process doesn't work anymore because this person left the company, or we moved to the cloud, or we added some other technologies that then breaks this system. So measure the effectiveness of my people and my process. I'm finding that organizations that are really practiced in leveraging security validation type controls to measure effectiveness using the latest threat intel, when they're continually practicing and validating their tools and people and processes, when something bad happens, it's like a football team. They've practiced, they know what to do. When somebody runs left, they go left too. When something happens, they know if A, then B. And it sounds like such a simple thing, but historically, when we look at incident response, for example, in security, maybe we do some wargaming. We sit around a whiteboard. We kind of talk through, okay, when do we bring legal into this or HR? How do we escalate this? Do we need to bring in our PR rep? What's the process? And those aren't bad things. Those are all good things to have. But you also need some sort of just meat and potatoes, operational. If this attack happens, are our tools ready to respond? How will they respond? Do our people know how to use them? So using security effectiveness controls like validation or breach and attack simulation, or even bringing in red teamers to do this on a periodic basis, not my favorite option, but it's better than nothing for sure, can help you measure your tools, your processes, and the people that are actually operating those, which will give you a huge advantage. I cherry-picked a few different board members and a few different quotes. Obviously, most of these interviews are anywhere between 30 to 60 minutes. We have 100 plus of these. So if you want to check them out, there's some of the earlier ones were audio only, but then we switched over to video, which are, I think, a little bit easier to digest. But you can check out these interviews. It's a Cybersecurity Effectiveness podcast. It's on Spotify and iTunes and Mandiant. We have it on our website as well now. But it's a great way to kind of get these perspectives from these leaders directly from them, to understand what do they really care about. And they have no skin in the game to tell you one thing or the other. They're just saying, hey, I sit on 20 boards and this is what's happening again and again and again. So I think you'll probably get some good input from them. So with that, I'll turn things back over to Kim, but I appreciate you guys giving me some time today.
Okay, well, thank you, Brian. We do have some time. We have about 8 minutes and there are some questions. So let's try to cover as many questions as we have in 8 minutes. Laura T said, so I'm curious as to what my colleagues feel are those critical security metrics to share with the BOD.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where you're finding now that there's a lot more commonality between the cybersecurity leaders and the sales leaders and the operations and the finance leaders than before, because you are all talking about risk and you're talking about that level of risk. So they're saying, hey, these are the types of trends that we're reporting on. This is what we're trying to show. It's not going to map one-to-one, but it definitely gives you a feel. And I've talked to so many CISOs that they never have those conversations. They just go in there to talk about what they think is important, what's the latest great. And there's some room for that, but really understanding how your peers are presenting can really change how you send that data out and make it easier for the board to interpret and understand.
So Nicole said, so Brian, hypothetically speaking, how would you handle Equifax pushback from BOD on update box bounce ?
There are going to be pushbacks, right? So just because you've done everything right and you present to the board, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to make a change. A great example is, I was talking to one of the board members that I interviewed. I didn't actually have them quoted in this particular one, but he said, look, we went in and we told the board, these are the issues that we're having. And I think it was like a $5 million price tag to address it. So it wasn't cheap. For this particular organization, it wasn't horribly expensive either, but $5 million is a lot. It doesn't really matter who you are. And they basically said, look, we have some holes here. For them, it was exposing some customer data. They said, if we have this type of breach, we're not going to be able to detect it. They're going to be able to get information out. We could, expose customer data, which is, of course, one of the biggest sins in security is exposing customer data. And the feedback from the board was quite simple. It's like, look, we get it. Thank you for presenting this to us. We agree that we need to make these investments. Let's see what we can do with what we have now for compensating controls, which, by the way, wasn't much. There really wasn't much that they could have done. And we'll revisit this again next quarter. And the reason is we need to maximize the level of cash we have because we're about ready to embark in a new, they were actually doing an acquisition as well. So they were going through an acquisition. They weren't able to, make that investment at that particular time. And they said, look, we're going to operate with this known risk. And from a security perspective, we're like, oh, how dare you? How could you operate with a known risk? Well, businesses operate with hundreds of known risks all the time. It's a risk to buy a company. It's a risk to move your, part of your business to Asia. It's a risk to invest in this new product or this new or add more research. Everything's a risk. Cyber is just another flavor of risk. As security people, we look at it as it's the end of the world, and it might be a very, very bad risk that needs to be addressed. But in their grand scheme of risks, at that particular time and place, maybe it's not as critical. So our job, I feel, as security executives, is to educate as best we can based on evidence so that they understand, really try to get that message across. But at the end of the day, the business isn't in business to be the most secure from a cyber perspective. They're in business to make money in most cases. So that's the best you can do. But you are going to get kicked in the teeth every once in a while. That is for sure.
We have tons of questions, and unfortunately with the virtual world, we're going to get cut off soon. But Rochelle said, how often do you suggest validation testing for mid-sized nonprofit organizations?
Yeah. So I would love to say, and for the reality to be, I think everybody should test 24/7. I know that's a utopian type idea. But I do feel that larger enterprises, government organizations, et cetera, I know most of them are doing I don't want to say 24/7, but they're doing daily automated tests. And that could be 1,000 different tests. It could be 10,000. It really just depends. Now, when you start to get into mid-size, that's where it gets kind of interesting, and nonprofit organizations as well. And mid-size can be a pretty big term. Some countries, they're only mid-size based on how we measure things. But when you look at mid-size, I really think that that's where we need to leverage that software platform with a service, leveraging a managed security service provider or some other type of organization that can help augment that. Because I don't think just because you're mid-size and you're not a Fortune 10, that your risk profile goes down. In fact, I know it doesn't go down. So you have the same risks that they do. Your customers getting their data stolen is bad, just like their customers getting stolen, but you simply don't have the resources. So I do feel that you should be able to use an automated mechanism augmented by some type of services provider capability that allows you to do, we'll just say, continuous testing, whether that's daily or weekly type testing to measure that. But to try to do all that in-house as a mid-sized company would probably be a little bit cost prohibitive and a little challenging, because now you have dedicated resources focusing on this. So I would say definitely look at managed security service providers and other organizations that can help augment your security controls by providing probably threat intelligence and security validation as sort of a joint service to do this for you.
There are many more questions. So what I'm going to do is show Brian how to get on the chat because we have to wrap up, and he can, if he has time, he can go in and individually message the rest of the questions, and everyone will be able to see those questions. Does that sound good to you, Brian?
That sounds great.
I wish we had more time. So thank you so much for being here again. And that's the way to contact Brian. You can find him out there on LinkedIn. I know from a fact that he's very responsive to his messages. You can also go up to the network lounge, and all of our attendees, you can message anyone. It will go to your inbox. It doesn't give people your email. It just happens to go to your inbox that it's a message from this conference.